Alright, so this is lesson 2.4, multiplying polynomials. This is a flipped class lesson, so hopefully you're watching this video at home before we actually have class tomorrow, where you will be learning how to actually apply the math tomorrow in class when you get the time to practice with me in the room helping you. Alright. So, multiplying polynomials. By now you know what polynomials are. Now you know how to add them and subtract them, but you don't know how to multiply them. We use two methods in this class to multiply them. One is the area diagram. The other one is the distributive property. You need to know how to use both, but you can depend on one or the other. So, most people like to use the area diagram, but you also need to understand how distributive property works. So we'll show you both, and then you can choose which one you use, but you know how both work. So the area diagram is quite nice. What you do is you take the first polynomial that you see, and you write it out like so. And you start to make a grid. You then take the other one, the x minus 5, and you put it down the other side of the grid. Notice that my negative sign stayed with my 5. And now you'll see we have all these little squares, right? There's 6 little squares here, and we need to fill those 6 squares. We fill those 6 squares by multiplying the column and the row together. So for instance, if we had x squared and x, and we multiply those together, we get x to the power of 3, because we would add the exponents. If we had x times 2x, you would have 2x squared. Remember, numbers go with numbers, so coefficients go with coefficients, and letters go with letters, so the x times x gives us the x squared. Our third box over here, 6 times x gives us 6x. And we start to fill out the bottom. With the bottom, it's super important that we see that negative sign. And remember, everything we multiply that negative sign. So it's negative 5 times x squared, so we get negative 5x squared. We then go negative 5 times 2x, and we get negative 10x. Because negative 5 times 2 is negative 10, and the x is still just there. Lastly, negative 5 times 60, negative 5 times 6 is negative 30. Now you see all those numbers in green, the insides of the boxes. That's your answer. So you want to write all of that out as if it's a polynomial. So x cubed plus 2x squared plus 6x minus 5x squared minus 10x minus 30. So I've used up all of those green things in the middle. Our last step is to collect our like terms. So, x cubes can only go with other x cubes. Since that's the only one, we write it x cubed. X squares can go with x squares. So if we have 2x squares and we subtract 5x squares, that gives us negative 3x squares. Our 6x and our minus 10x can go together. So if you have 6 x's and you subtract 10 x's, you have negative 4 x's. And then lastly, you should use your negative 30 up by itself. Remember, that's called a constant. And that is your final answer, so we box it. That's called the area diagram. Again, that's the most popular one usually in our school. It's very nice and organized, so if you're not a very organized individual, that's kind of the perk of it. Okay, distributive property. So distributive property is a little bit different. What we'll do is we'll write out our question. X squared plus 2x plus 6 times x minus 5. One thing we should mention is, you notice there's no times symbol here. The reason we know it's multiplying is because there's nothing in between the brackets, right there. So if there's nothing written in between those brackets and you have brackets touching each other like that, that means multiplication. Okay, distributive property. So how distributive property works is you take your polynomial, whichever one you want. I'm going to use x minus 5. You take the very first thing in x minus 5, and you distribute it all the way across to the first thing in the other polynomial. And when you distribute it, you times those things together. So my first multiplication here is x times x squared, which gives me x to the power of 3. I then take that x and I distribute it again into the second thing that we see. So now we have x times 2x. That gives us plus 2x squared. And we just add the exponents. And now we take x and we distribute it to the very last thing in the other polynomial, and we get plus 6x. Because 6 times x is 6x. Now we're going to take the next thing in our polynomial. So we started by taking x's. Now we're going to take the negative 5, and we're going to distribute it in. So negative 5 times x squared gives me negative 5x squared. I'm just multiplying those together. I take negative 5 and I distribute it into the second thing that we see. Negative 5 times 2x would be negative, because a negative times a positive is always a negative. 5 times 2 is 10. And then the x is still a regular single x. And our last distribution will be negative 5 to that 6 to give me negative 30. Now, just like area diagram, we need to go ahead and collect our like terms. So x cubes will go with any other x cubes that you see. That's the only one. So we write it out. X squares will go with any x squares you see. You have 2x squared and you subtract 5x squared, that gives you negative 3x squared. X's go with x's. So if you have 6x minus 10x, you have negative 4x. And lastly, negative 30 can't go with anything else because it's a constant. There's no other constants. That's your final answer. And you should notice we have the same answer using either method, which is why it's your choice. All right. Determine the product of the following polynomials. So what I am going to do here is I'm going to do some questions. I will use area diagram because, again, that is usually the most popular one. For A, you'll notice that there's a 2 out front. So when we have a number out front, what I like to do is I like to leave that number till the very end. And instead, what I do is I focus on the other polynomials and I multiply those polynomials together first. So I'm going to go x minus 3 across the top. That's my first polynomial. And then I'm going to go 2x minus 9 down the side. And you'll see I've created my boxes again. Those negatives are very important. Notice that the 3 is a negative 3 and the 9 is a negative 9. Now we can start filling in our boxes. So 2x times x would give us 2x squared. Remember, we add the exponents on the x's. We go 2x times negative 3, that gives us negative 6x. We go negative 9 times x, we get negative 9x. We have negative 9 times negative 3. That gives us a positive number, and it's 27. We then write out everything we see in that box. So we have 2x squared minus 6x minus 9x plus 27. And we're going to do something strange here. We're going to put our answer that we have right now in brackets. And the reason we're putting it in brackets is because we can't forget about this 2 up here. So this 2 up here, we need to bring it with our answer, and it's still out front. Now, we need to distribute that 2 into the brackets, and you should remember that from our previous lesson, multiplying a monomial by a polynomial. But before we multiply that 2 into the brackets, I'm going to collect my like terms. Because remember, that's always your last step when you're multiplying polynomials together. And you see we have some x's there that can go together. So we have 2 times 2x squared. We have negative 15x's plus 27. Now we can distribute this 2 in. So the 2 multiplies into the first thing. It's going to be 4x squared. It then distributes into the second thing. It give me negative 30x. And it multiplies into the last thing to give me positive 54. So when you get a big question like this where you have a polynomial times a monomial, we leave the monomial to the very end because you see how easy it was to just distribute that monomial into the end and multiply everything by 2. If you look at B, B is a little trickier because we actually have 3 binomials. To handle 3 binomials, what we want to do is we want to multiply the first 2 binomials together, and then we want to multiply whatever our answer is by the third binomial. So let's do that. So we're going to take this first one. We're going to write it on the top of our little square. We're going to take our second one, and we're going to write it down the side of our square. Notice that my 5 is a negative 5 on the top. Don't ever forget to write your negatives in there. Very important. And then we start to fill in the inside. 2x squared times 3x is 6x cubed. So the 2 and the 3 multiply together. And then the x squared and the x become x cubed. 3x times negative 5 is negative 15x. 2x squared times 1 is 2x squared. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. We then write everything out. So we have 6x cubed plus 2x squared minus 15x minus 5. And like we did before, we're going to put our answer in brackets. Because we're not done yet, we have to multiply by this other binomial, this one up here. We haven't used it yet, so we must write it back out. Now you look at this again, we have a 4-term polynomial in the green times a 2-term binomial in the red. We have to do another area diagram, but with those things times each other. So I'm going to write the first one along the top, 6x cubed, and then plus 2x squared, and then minus 15x, and minus 5. And then we write our red ones down the side, so 2x, and then minus 8. Alright, we have to fill out this area diagram. So to do that, we multiply 2x times 6x cubed. That gives us 12x to the 4. 2x times 2x squared is 4x cubed. 2x times negative 15x is negative 30x squared. 2x times negative 5 is negative 10x. Negative 8 times 6x cubed is negative 48x cubed. Negative 8 times 2x is negative 16x squared. Negative 8 times negative 15 is positive 120x. Then negative 8 times negative 5 is positive 40. Now, as you get better at these things, you should see some tricks. And those tricks are that you usually get your like terms on little diagonals. So, for instance, this one we see is just by itself, so it's 12x to the power of 4. But our next term, 4x cubed and negative 48x cubed, they're on a diagonal to each other. And we can just combine them right away rather than write them all out individually. So those would combine to be negative 44x cubed. And then you see we have two more like terms on a diagonal from each other to give us negative 46x squared. And then we have two more on a diagonal from each other to give us positive 110x. And then lastly, we have our plus 40. So that is our answer. And that's a very big answer, but it makes sense it's a big answer since it was a pretty big question. All right, our last thing that we have to look at and deal with is when we have binomials. So we have a binomial here. We have a binomial here. And that binomial is squared. So we have to figure out what we want to do with that square sign. Now in our previous unit, we used to take that square sign and we used to distribute it in. But we can't do that here. And the reason we can't do that here is because this is a binomial. See this plus sign? That plus sign means we cannot distribute the two in. So that's a big no-no. Instead, what we do is we cross out that square and we write a second binomial. Because remember, that's what it means when you have something squared. It means you have two of them multiplied together. So instead of writing it the quick way, which is using the square sign, we write it the long way, we write them side by side. We then go ahead and we multiply them together. We're going to multiply them together using our area diagram, which we should be getting pretty good at by now. So I'm going to fill out the inside here. I got those numbers by just multiplying like we have been previously. And your last step is to write them all out. And then you have to collect your like terms. And if you want to use the trick of collecting the like terms before writing them all out, that's okay. Just be very careful and make sure you use all of the terms. Our last step is we need to combine these two things. So it's 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. You see how quick these things can go as you practice more and more and more, which is why we're going to spend our next class practicing. Now our same rule applies for question B. We see there's a cube there, so this cube right there, but we can't distribute it in because it wasn't a monomial in the middle, it was a binomial. That's what that subtraction does, it creates a binomial. So instead what we do is we cross it out and we now write it. So there's 3 of them. Like that. And we use our trick to multiply 3 polynomials by just doing the area diagram twice. So we'll do the first one here. We'll do 2x minus 1. And then we'll do the second one here. 2x minus 1. And we'll fill out our little grid. So 2x times 2x would be 4x squared. 2x times negative 1 would be negative 2x. 2x times negative 1 would be another negative 2x. Negative 1 times negative 1 would be plus 1. So that's a positive 1. And I'm going to make note that this only used these first two polynomials. That third one hasn't been used yet. So we have to take our answer that we collected here. So our answer is 4x squared. So using that thing. I'm going to combine my two like terms here. My negative 2x and my negative 2x to give me negative 4x. And then plus 1. That's my answer from the first two polynomials. The two that I've crossed out up here. But I have to use this third one still. This one hasn't been used. So what we need to do is make sure we write it down here. And our last step is now to multiply these things together. So we have 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 along the top. And we have 2x minus 1 along the bottom. We fill this out, we get 8x cubed, we get negative 8x squared, we get 2x. Down here we get negative 4x squared, we get positive 4x, and then we get negative 1. And again, your last step is to collect like terms. I'm going to use the tricky quick method again. So I'm going to collect like terms as I write them out. So this first one is 8x cubed. I then see I have 2x squared terms that can be combined together. So negative 8x squared minus 4x squared is negative 12x squared. I've got two more right here, so positive 2x plus 4x is positive 6x. And then lastly, my constant. Once we've used all of our binomials and multiplied them all together, we are done. So that concludes 2.4. Hopefully you come ready with some questions and ready to practice tomorrow. See you tomorrow.